Part two of the reform era of the early 1800s. We're moving on to the next slide. This is the abolition movement and slavery. Life under slavery between the 1790s and 1830s, the population almost doubles in America. Most slaves could understand English. Men and women slaves were equal in the fact that they had no rights. And the rise of the plantation system changes slaves' lives. Remember, Eli Whitney's going to come along in 1793 and develop this cotton gin, and the plantation system explodes. So let's look at rural slavery real quick. Slaves lived and worked in groups of 10. They worked from dawn to dusk, and if it was a full moon, they worked 24 to 48 hours, often being whipped for slow work by other slaves, the foreman. On the plantation systems, it could be a master as well. Lived in windowless homes. They were exposed to the elements. They had chimneys made out of mud and wood, so it's very dangerous because as they slept on the ground, these fires could catch the house on fire and burn it down. Urban slavery. These slaves worked in cities, and some worked in skilled positions. They worked right beside free people and in the textile mills, and they were almost free themselves. They were less supervised, and they would typically go home to their master. The slavery that we see in the movies a lot is the rural slavery. It's oppressive. It's bad. Urban slavery is a little bit harder to portray because, as you see, they work right alongside free people. They work beside free people, and they're not as supervised. So that one's a little more tricky to portray. Okay, so the abolition movement, basically, it's a push to abolish slavery in America. You have different schools of thought on how we should end slavery. Should we do it gradually? That's called gradualism. Slavery ended gradually. We stopped new slaves from entering the institution, phase out slavery in the North, phase it out in the Upper South, and finally phase it out in the Lower South. Compensation to workers for losses, and this would help the economy adjust over time. So we have the colonization movement, and this was to send African Americans back to Africa, primarily Liberia. American Colonization Society was formed. However, it was quickly realized that this was too expensive, and many African Americans consider America their home now because they were born and raised here. They don't have the cultural ties to Africa. So this young man, David Walker, he's a freed African American from North Carolina. He writes a book called Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World, and in this book he advocates for violence, and he says we're going to have a rebellion to end the slavery institution in America. He's very forceful in his book, and he paints a picture that we're going to have to go through some sort of a rebellion. So William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison opens the Liberator. It's a newspaper in Massachusetts, and it calls for the end of slavery immediately, not gradually, and not over time, and no colonization. He says we need to end slavery yesterday. It's a crime against humanity and everything that lives and breathes if it's allowed another day. He opens this newspaper in 1831. That's an important year. And this is one of the first articles he posts in it. And you can read this, but basically he's saying you don't do things moderately. When you see an abuse against humanity, when you see an abuse against a people, it's your duty to act immediately. So Frederick Douglass, he's a former slave from Maryland. He escaped slavery. If you know the story, he was taught to read and write at a young age, and he was a skilled worker. And he ends up escaping slavery, and he becomes, in the 1800s, he becomes probably the most famous African American in the U.S. He writes a famous speech, "I am a thief." And he delivers that quite a few times. In 1847, the North Star, he opens this newspaper, it's his own paper, the North Star. And in this paper, he does not believe we need to go through a war to end slavery. He worked for the Liberator for a number of years. He worked for William Lloyd Garrison, and he just came to believe that we didn't need to go through a war to end slavery. And here's why. Because slavery was ended in Britain in 1833, and it was ended with a law. You just passed an act. You passed a law, and it ended slavery. Keep in mind, this abolition movement, there's no one thing that will point to it and say, oh, that's why we, morality and stuff like that. It comes out of the Enlightenment. The abolition movement comes out of the Enlightenment, and is it reasonable to treat people this way? Is it reasonable to enslave one race of people or one group of people? So anyway, he believes we don't have to go through a war. That view will change in the 1850s, though. This is a famous picture of Harriet Tubman here. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and put all the answers up here for you. So Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. What was the Underground Railroad? It's a system of escape routes on land and water. She's known as the Black Moses. She herself was an escaped slave, so she will have a bounty on her head. Why was she seen as the Black Moses? Because she risked her life each time to go down south and to rescue slaves. She made 19 trips in all, and she helped save some 300 slaves. So she was a great lady, a great conductor. And if you look at her later life, she actually serves in the American Civil War, and she fought valiantly there as well. So Harriet Tubman is definitely one of these abolitionists you need to remember. Her actions spoke a lot louder than her words. So this is a picture of a family she helped save. If you read here, you see that there $40,000 for her capture at that time, and that's a lot of money in the 1840s, 1850s. So there you go. Here's some of the escape routes from the South. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's one of the its main message in the book was that slavery was not just a political struggle, it was a moral struggle as well. Is it morally right to do this to people? So the morality of slavery comes out in this book more. So Isabella Baumfree, or Sojourner Truth, she had been a slave for 30 years. She travels the country and she speaks out on slavery and on women's rights. She was a strong women's rights advocate, and she was a strong believer in the right to vote. So if the first, she does say in one of her speeches here, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it on the right side up again. And now they're asking to do it, and the men better let them. So Sarah and Angelina Grimke, these are two daughters of a slave owner down in, I believe, the Charleston area down in South Carolina. They're Southern sisters, and they are going to write a book called Appeal of the Christian Women of the South in 1836. It's published, and they're going to fight against slavery, and they talk about the abuses and what they had seen in their life. So what is the Northern reaction to abolition? And there's a wide range in the North. It ranges from support of abolition to indifference and not caring one way or the other, apathy. Dangerous to the existing social institution. People saw that in the North, that is dangerous to free slaves in the existing social institution. Businessmen would warn, as of the 1830s and 40s, they would warn of a destructive war that could come from it. Flooding the labor market and housing markets in the North. So housing is going to be in short supply, and of course you're going to have so many laborers wanting to work there that not everybody's going to get a job. As far as the banking system is concerned, Southern planters owed a lot of money to Northern banks. So as you see, they didn't want the Southern economy to crumble. The banks in the North would rather leave things the way they were because they wouldn't want to see the Southern economy crumble and be left holding the bag with no money. So what was the Southern attitude towards slavery, or this particular institution? They saw slavery as a vital need to the economy. Outlawing it would kill the cotton economy, widespread unemployment, and chaos. Southerners would quickly point to the history of slavery. It had existed in every civilization in world history, dating back to, remember world history, you talked about the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, dating back to those early civilizations, they all had slaves. Remember old world slavery, guys? These are slaves that were prisoners of war, pretty much, or that's how they made up their slave population. So courts defended slavery, property rights. Your Fifth Amendment to the Constitution guarantees property, so property rights. And South Carolina governor would call it a national benefit. Slaves had no desire for freedom. This was a theory as well, because the friendships developed over time between with their owners. They didn't want to leave the plantation, or they didn't want to leave their owner. So that was a theory as well. And of course, religion will help back up this attitude towards slavery, and that is, in the Bible, Abraham had slaves. The Ten Commandments, the New Testament, Paul returned a slave to the divine institution. So they were going to use religion. Southerners use religion as well to back up their argument of slavery. So this is an activity. You can look at it, and guys, basically, I think we're going to do this in class as well, or we may not do it, but you just look and tell me the differences between these two pictures. So here's some punishment devices. Pretty brutal, some of them. This gentleman, look at his back. I mean, horrible. So, slave rebellions. Denmark Vesey was a freed African-American carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, and as you see, he organizes a group of 80 African-American leaders and planned and organized the 9,000 slaves to take over Charleston in 1822. What led to his downfall is he's betrayed, he's captured by the state government with his men. 35 men were hanged, including himself, and 37 were banished from South Carolina, so that means they could never come back. So with Nat Turner, we'll pick up Nat Turner on part 3.